Thank you all for coming and welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. We want to thank Roberta Jones. Roberta, please stand up. Every room needs a hero. Roberta Jones is our hero because the 3 programs, and I suspect we'll have a lot of repeat audience on Thursday. You have tomorrow off to go home and read about Andrew Jackson. But today you're going to get a great dose of Andrew Jackson. And Roberta Peters made this possible, her sponsorship. So again, thank you, Roberta. I want to thank Dustin Ingham, who's back up in our spiffy new production booth. Thank you. He'll do the sound, and we're videotaping this, so if you do have to leave early or you miss Thursday or you miss Friday, this will be on channel 17 if you live in Rancho Mirage. How many people live in Rancho Mirage? A goodly number. We will not have question and answer today. Bill is a stern taskmaster, and he's going to tell you so much you won't have any questions. We guarantee that. The other thing is you'll notice this kind of new perch that we have here, or just a little bit up off the ground. That is so that the great Bill Gudelunas doesn't block anybody in the front row when, in his normal mode, he is a racehorse on stage. He's not going to do that today. He's going to be kind of landlocked here, but I think you'll make the best of it, right?
I'm making the best of Trump.
All right. We know we're just about underway. One more quick advertisement. You've seen this envelope. You've seen me prance around here with it. We have so far, with our fall solicitation, raised $46,000. That ain't bad. And we wouldn't mind a few more shekels, as we say in these envelopes. So if you like this program, all of our programs are funded by individuals like Roberta and our foundation. So if you do make a contribution, thank you. If you don't, go home guilty. Okay, so finally, we are glad you're here. And thanks to Professor William Gudelunas, we sort of own him in a small way. We'd love to. Class is in session. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I always forget. I want to thank Dustin and Susan and David. They really make it a pleasure. Thank you, Roberta. I can't. And I promise no Desert Hot Springs jokes. I did promise that, right? And I'm really, you don't know how I want to thank you people. I really mean this. I miss teaching so bad. I'm not good at retirement. I'm really terrible at it. And this is my one big chance all year to kind of give a lecture again. And I'm still sorry I can't run around, but that's okay. I'll stand here. I really want to thank you. See, this crowd is unbelievable. I don't know if there are 400 or 500 here. And when I go back home, I'm going to tell my friends there were 500 or 600. And I know what you're thinking. What kind of 70-year-old man would be immature enough and narcissistic enough to worry about crowd size? And my wife, Kellyanne, or Barbara, is going to exaggerate too when we get home. I also, one last thing, then I really will get started. Andrew Jackson was kind of my hero in a lot of ways. He's kind of come down a little bit lately in the minds of historians. But I had 2 great heroes, Jackson and Kennedy. And I always had a dream I'd have 2 sons, and one would be Andrew Jackson Gudelunas, the other one John Kennedy Gudelunas. Imagine that. I mean, how long were those kids lasted in 5th grade? What's your name, kid? Andrew. But anyway, my wife overrules me on everything, and I didn't get to name them that. So one day I got really angry. I said, damn it, they're my kids too, aren't they? And she said, are they? And that ended... That ended the whole thing. All right, Andrew Jackson. Wait a minute, did I advance? No, okay. The Donald and the Andrew, that's the Fox News version, right? Sean Hannity version, there you go. And incidentally, that picture Susan used to use of me that was about 50 years old. She made me look a little young, you know. She did the same thing with Jackson. That's more what he looks like. That one that is on the flyer, it's a little bit overdone. But there's D. Andrew and D. Donald, and that's the MSNBC version. And the tragedy is there's not much in between, you know what I mean? But which do you prefer? I don't know. Okay, and there's another one. That's when Donald was 185 pounds. He's now 188. Not bad after all those years. And you remember Michael, of course. And there you go. So just so you know, enough of that. And I will do a little comparison. That's Rachel Jackson. Okay. All right. I'll get to Rachel later. She's not quite as good looking as Melania, I'll guarantee you that one. Okay. I'm only going to do the Donald and the Andrew at the end when I give Jackson's rankings by historians and all that kind of stuff. And I will do some comparisons and contrasts, but I'm going to try to be fair and try to be neutral. I have some liberal leanings maybe, but I'm in Rancho Mirage, so that more than cancels it out. The playground of presidents. Okay, and you don't know how much I love Rancho Mirage once a year. I'm telling you, this is, again, thank you, and I won't say it again. Jackson was born into poverty. 1767, he was born on the borderline between North and South Carolina. It was not clearly delineated then. He always claimed he was born on the what became the South Carolina side of the border. It was called the Waxhaws. There was an Indian tribe named the Waxhaws, and that part of the western part of the Carolinas still is called the Waxhaws area. And he was born there into relative poverty. His father died while his mother was just about ready to deliver Andrew. He had two older brothers. She was pregnant a third time with Andrew when his father died. And that was in 1767. Then the American Revolution broke out, and the Jacksons, his mother, was very pro-American, very anti-British, was very active for a woman at that time in the Revolution, did all she could in nursing and agitating and everything else. And Jackson actually, as a 13-year-old, kind of served in the American Revolution, helping American soldiers get food and stuff like that. He didn't have a uniform, but he, for all intents and purposes, was a soldier. He didn't have bone spurs, so he was able to serve. Okay. Did I miss that one? Try that next week. But anyway, here's the tragedy. His oldest brother was killed in the American Revolution, fighting at if you're interested, the Battle of Stono Ferry. A very minor battle, but not for a Jackson family. He died in an American uniform. And later on in the war, Jackson and his other brother, his other sole surviving brother, they were captured by the British. And a British soldier asked Jackson to shine his shoes. Jackson gave him what's the equivalent of today's middle finger. And the officer slashed Jackson across the forehead with a saber, and Jackson carried that British scar the rest of his life. And he got a lot of revenge at New Orleans in 1815. But he hated the English from then on in. He was Scotch-Irish, and a lot of those Scotch-Irish really didn't, over in the old country, didn't have the highest regard for England, not the lowest regard, but not the highest regard. So Jackson had this very strong anti-British animus, which he carried the rest of his life. He was, while they were prisoners, his brother died of cholera, probably. They were in a very cramped prisoner of war camp. Disease broke out. Might have been smallpox. Whatever it was, of course, they had no medical attention, and his brother died. Jackson somehow survived and came home to his mother. His mother then, amazingly, even though she had just lost two sons, just talk about being in love with the United States, and we weren't quite the United States yet, his mother then volunteered to go to a hospital, in essence, a prison, a ship hospital, if you will, where she tried to help nurse American prisoners who were, not prisoners, soldiers who were wounded in various battles in the Carolinas. And there she contracted probably smallpox or cholera, and she died also. So at the age of 14, a veteran of the American Revolution, if you will, he had lost 2 brothers and a mother to the American cause. That's one reason he loved his country from then on in. You didn't speak against the United States in front of Andrew Jackson. He did have, the myth is he had no education. His mother wanted him to be a minister. She would have been a little disappointed the way he turned out, but she did make sure he learned how to read and write. He got a maybe equivalent of a 3rd grade education. And then the ministers that his mother associated with did make sure he got some more education in reading the Bible. And being a Presbyterian, it was very important that he be able to read the Bible. And he did pick up enough reading ability. He could read the Bible, which, come on, is not the easiest thing in the world to read. He even had some crude knowledge of Latin, so he was not a total uneducated person. Later on, he educated himself, much like Lincoln. He became a lawyer. He read the law, which meant he didn't go to school or anything. There were no law schools per se. But he did read the law, apprenticed under another lawyer, eventually became a judge, and eventually a pretty good lawyer. Made a lot of money practicing law, and he loved being a judge. And he had no qualms about pronouncing the death sentence either. So he was not a total illiterate. He had a way with language, but he never had much of grammar training. He frequently misspelled words. In one letter that still exists, he misspelled the same word 3 different ways in the same letter without getting it right. The word was committee. So before you sit down, committee, that's not an easy one. But he misspelled committee 3 different ways and never got it right. But that didn't mean he was totally stupid. He wasn't. He was a very, very stable genius, shall we say? No, in Jackson's case, he was an unstable genius. Thank God, and I'm going to make this clear on Thursday, thank God we didn't have A-bombs when he was alive, or I'll guarantee you we wouldn't have any problem with South Carolina right now because it wouldn't exist. All right? Could have he prevented the Civil War, as Trump kind of indicated? Yep. Maybe, but it would have cost a few lives along the way. Anyway, so the impact of the American Revolution, there's his wife, okay. Jackson's rise to prominence after the war. Come on, is this going to shine? Oh, don't tell me. I don't have a pointer on it. Oh, there it is. Is that pointing? Yeah, it is. It just won't shine on that. There it is. It works. I keep wanting to see that. The heck with it. Okay. He rose to prominence in Tennessee. After the war, he was raised by his mother's kin. He never got along with them too well. He was kind of a roustabout. He was always involved in fights, and he loved outdoor activities, brawling. He always fell in love with horses, became a horse breeder later on in his life, loved horses, loved all kind of animals, and he was a great outdoorsman. And he eventually educated himself, and then he felt he had a better chance of moving ahead in the legal world if he moved out west, or up west, they called it, to Tennessee. And he wound up around Nashville. And he wound up in a boarding house where many people lived in these days. They didn't have Motel 6s or anything. And he wound up in a boarding house run by a woman named Donaldson. And she had a very beautiful daughter named Rachel Donaldson. And Jackson immediately fell in love with her, and she with Jackson. There was a small problem, which wouldn't be a problem today, but it was a problem back then. She was married to someone else. Now you just play house with the other one. If you're Catholic, you get an annulment and start over. It doesn't really matter. Okay, but anyway, he fell in love with Rachel and she with him. Now, he was a lawyer, and he was not a stupid person. And he said he assumed Rachel had been divorced. She was married to a guy named Robards, who was very abusive, both physically and verbally, mentally. And Jackson wanted to kind of rescue her, and he assumed, he said, that she had obtained a divorce, and he married her. And it turned out she wasn't divorced. Now, you have to remember, and here's why Jackson is full of it. In these days, in Tennessee and in most states, only a man could sue for divorce. Woman had no right to do it, no matter what. And Tennessee was certainly like that. In fact, still is. All right. And, for example, in some states, I'm not sure Tennessee, but New York was one, you could only get divorced if the man applied for divorce, and only on grounds of adultery. Only under New York law, a man couldn't commit adultery, only a woman. Lucky they didn't have the transgender stuff then, and it would have really got complicated. But anyway, he knew darn well she wasn't divorced, but they got married, and Robards, her husband, then came back into town and quite frankly wanted to blackmail Jackson, who had a couple bucks and had some political ambitions. And Jackson refused to play his game. He let Robards had applied to you had to apply to the Tennessee state legislature for a divorce. Imagine this. What, in California now you sign your name and that's it, right? I'm not being, that's the way it is, right? 30 days, goodbye. Okay, no fault, they call it, or something like that, right? All right, but anyway, in Tennessee in these days, you had to have the state legislature, which only met like 3 or 4 months every 2 years. They had to pass a bill that became a law signed by the governor to give you your divorce, and only the man could initiate it. So Robards was in the process of getting the divorce, but it hadn't been finalized. Jackson then hurried it up, gave Robards some money. He had a lot of influence in the state capitol, and Robards' divorce decree was granted. Jackson then married Rachel. And for the rest of their lives, and they were very much in love. I have a story, a lecture about presidential escapades, and someone always asked me, are there any presidential couples that were really, truly in love? Well, sure. Certainly Andrew Jackson was with Rachel through his whole life. Rachel was it from then on in. I certainly think Calvin Coolidge was very, very, very close to his wife. Bill Clinton and Hillary, there was never a scandal there. So yeah, there were some, but the closest of all, see, I'm an equal opportunity offender. The closest couple, I honestly think, was the Jackson couple, Andrew and Rachel. But Rachel, from then on, because of their adulterous, and Robards then amended his divorce petition and claimed adultery and named Jackson as what they called a respondent, that he was the man forcing Rachel, in essence, to be in an adulterous situation. Okay, so whenever Jackson ran for office, people pilloried Rachel. They attack Rachel. And she never had any kids. That was their only deep regret. They had a very happy and fulfilling marriage, but they never had any children. And Jackson, and some modern gynecologists might agree with this, pediatricians, Jackson claimed that the tension that she was under from then on in, and she blamed herself for all the problems that Jackson suffered politically, that tension prevented her from conceiving. Maybe, maybe not. There is some, I have a cousin that's big time in writing articles on this kind of stuff. He's an MD, and he always reminds me he has a real doctorate and I don't, you know, and I love the guy. All right, but anyway, he said, yeah, that's very, it's a factor. It could be a factor. And Jackson became very defensive of Rachel, and anybody that slurred her name, he would take serious offense. There was a guy named Dickinson later on who insulted Rachel, and almost as bad as that, insulted Jackson's racehorses. And Jackson challenged him to a duel, even though Dickinson was one of the best shots in Tennessee. And Jackson would not back out. He was too macho. And when he and Dickinson met at a field only 12 paces apart, it was almost sure one of them was going to get shot. And Jackson purposely arranged for the duel early in the morning, and he wore an oversized coat and let Dickinson fire first. And Dickinson hit him in what he thought was the heart, but turned out to be his shoulder. And Jackson spun around, and they never, ever got that bullet out. He lived until 1845, and they never got that bullet out of his body, just about 2.5, 3 inches from his heart, and they never wanted to go imagine probing around back then. So Jackson carried that bullet the rest of his life, but after he was shot, he then aimed, and his gun misfired, then he recocked it, and he didn't shoot in the air. He shot it right through Dickinson's heart. And so he's the only president of the United States that ever killed a man in his real life. Not in combat or anything like that, but he actually killed a man named Dickinson. So Jackson was a duelist. He was going to challenge Henry Clay, his archenemy. At one time, to a duel over Rachel. That never quite materialized, but Jackson was very, very defensive of Rachel. That's going to be very important probably on Thursday when I talk about the Peggy O'Neill affair. I'm going to give you a little dramatic foreshadowing. That was the worst social, sexual scandal, most important one in American history as far as its impact was concerned. I'm going to make an argument that Peggy O'Neill was the whore who caused the Civil War. I'm serious, and you can make an argument about that. But anyway, one of the reasons Jackson stood up for Peggy had nothing to do with him. They were not together or anything. But the reason he stood up for Peggy is because he saw in her a woman maligned by high society. He saw in her, of course, he saw Rachel. All right, and the tragedy of Rachel Jackson, and let me go ahead, and that's the best picture of hers. She was supposedly very beautiful, looks pretty nice. There it is. She looks pretty good there. What would Donald give her? 7, 7.5, 8? All right. A little above Hillary, maybe. I don't know. All right. But a little below Melania, though, somewhere. Okay. But anyway, the tragedy of Rachel. Jackson was determined to make her first lady. And she lived to see him get elected president in the fall of 1828. He was supposed to be and was inaugurated on March 4th, 1829. She died in his arms on December 23rd, 1828. She died just before Christmas. I used to lecture and say it was Christmas Eve. It was actually the 23rd. She died on December 23rd in his arms and never did become First Lady. And there was a movie that Charlton Heston, was it Charlton Heston, any movie fan, played Jackson? The president's lady, Susan Hayward? Yeah, she was very beautiful, redheaded, right? Well, anyway, Susan Hayward, I think, played Rachel. And in the last scene, it's all about this. And in the last scene, Charlton Heston takes a locket out of his, and it's a picture of Rachel. Actually, it was a picture of Wayne LaPierre. The NRA. Charlton Heston. NRA. Okay, so the marriage in trouble. But Jackson then became very prominent as a judge, a lawyer. He actually, in the 1790s, he served briefly, this is very rarely mentioned, he served briefly in the House of Representatives, served briefly as a senator. He didn't like that. He didn't like legislative bodies. He'd rather be a president, executive. He liked action. He couldn't stand the slow-moving legislative process. And truthfully, Trump has some trouble understanding that and accepting it because he's used to a business-type atmosphere. And Jackson was used to being a judge and a general, and you got things done, period, my way or the highway. And it's, you usually don't like legislative inaction. And certainly Trump doesn't. Certainly Jackson didn't. And it's understandable, very, very understandable. But the only prominent thing he did while he was a congressman and senator, both briefly from Tennessee, is he voted against giving George Washington a congratulatory reference from Congress when he retired after 2 terms as president. Jackson voted against congratulating George Washington. How about that one? He felt Washington was too much of an elitist, didn't care enough about the common farmers, and he absolutely refused to make the vote for Washington anywhere near unanimous. Absolutely not. And that was his one claim to fame. You got to give him, the guy had guts. He called it like he saw it. All right, so the marriage trouble. Then he also, his big ambition for some reason, I think because of his Revolutionary War stuff, was to become a member of the military. And in these days, there was a very small standing army, regular army. But almost every male in most states between the ages of 18 and, say, 40 most of the time, you had to be a member of the militia. And he joined the Tennessee militia. And in those days, militia officers were elected by their soldiers. And he was elected to higher and higher office and eventually became the commander of the Tennessee militia. That is why the Second Amendment, which is misunderstood by both sides of the gun argument, in my opinion, the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged. I think I have that exactly right. That's because there was a fear that the central government would outlaw guns and then there would be no militia. And what would the state do? In these days in Tennessee, in most states, you had very few local police, you had no state police. Maybe you had one sheriff for a whole county, and he rode around on a horse, obviously. All right, so what's he going to do? So you had to have, when a trouble broke out, you had to call the militia. And every man in the militia, every man was forced to join the militia between certain ages, and you had to provide your own gun. You had to provide your own gun. If you didn't have one, you had to take out a loan from the state or the county to buy a gun. So that's it. It's kind of like Chicago now. Everybody owns a gun. All right. Kind of like Indian Wells, too. A lot of violence down there. I won't mention my favorite city. Yeah, I will one time. My church ran a raffle back east over the winter. First prize was a week in Desert Hot Springs. Second prize was 2 weeks in Desert Hot Springs. That's it. I promised. End of it. All right. So Jackson gets into militia. Eventually rises to become, and to the day he died, he didn't want to be called President Jackson. He wanted to be called General Jackson. In fact, you go to Disney World in Orlando, I don't know if it's the same way, but there was a restaurant, a floating restaurant called the General Jackson. It was like a paddle wheeler. And they argued, should they call it the President Jackson? No, Andy definitely would have wanted it to be called the General Jackson. Very much more proud of being a general than he was of being president. And he made that very clear in his will, to be honest with you. General Jackson, not President Jackson. All right, so he becomes a very good Indian fighter. He fought in many Indian battles, and right around the War of 1812, an Indian uprising occurred in what is now the Georgia, Alabama area, was then too. Georgia was a state, but Alabama wasn't. And it was led by the Creek Indians, C-R-E-E-K. If you remember that Davy Crockett song, Davy Crockett fought with Jackson in the Creek Wars, fought single-handed through the Indian Wars till the Creeks was whipped and peace was in store. Well, Crockett did fight with Jackson, under Jackson in one of those Creek Wars. And the Creeks Jackson knew were divided into two. The Red Sticks Creeks were the more militant, and the regular Creeks were the more moderate. And the white man's money could always buy off the regular Creeks and push them farther west. But the Red Stick Creeks didn't want to take any more money. They wanted to set up a casino and make money that way. All right. So Jackson, the Red Sticks went on the warpath, as Indians frequently did back here. And Jackson defeated the Creeks in a battle called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, one of the most important Indian battles in American history, present-day Alabama. And Jackson won the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He defeated the Creeks in a couple other battles, won at Talladega. Does that sound familiar if you're a NASCAR fan? And eventually, get this, he forced the Indians to give the white man 20 million acres of their land. 20 million acres. And what he did, the thing I find very wrong about Jackson here, he actually recruited the regular Creeks, the non-Red Stick Creeks, and he recruited Cherokees, the second big tribe down in that area. And he used them to fight against the Red Sticks with the promise that when he took land, he would not take it off the Cherokee and the Red Sticks. First thing he did in the Treaty of Fort Jackson is take all their land. So he double-crossed the Indians that actually fought with him. I can't forgive him for that one, Andy. Can't forgive you. I'm not naming my third son Andy Jackson. I'll guarantee. No, and that's one of the reasons Jackson is not ranked quite as high as he used to be today, not as much revered as he was, say, 50 years ago, is because of this Indian stuff and the fact that we're now very conscious of Native American history and all. Back when I went to grad school, it wasn't quite that way. All right, so Jackson is fighting the Indians, making a great reputation. Then the War of 1812 breaks out. And the British, at the end, toward what became the end of the War of 1812, the British decided they wanted to invade New Orleans. And word leaked out that that was going to happen. The regular army, we didn't have much of an army in the War of 1812, very small army. We depended on militias, and it was a mess. We really messed up the War of 1812. Lucky we came out with our hides. But anyway, when President Madison heard the British were going to invade New Orleans, try to block up the Mississippi River, the British, as a seafaring country, always militarily think about hurting the other guy by hurting his seaports, by hurting his commerce. So the British wanted to attack New Orleans, and that got out. And Madison then asked Congress to make Jackson a major general, that's 2 stars, in the regular army. For many years, Jackson had been refused a generalship in the regular army. He was a general in the Tennessee militia, but not the regular army. Now, not only did they make him a general, but they gave him 2 stars. And there was only one general at that time that had 3 stars, no more. So he was, in effect, the 2nd or 3rd highest ranking general overnight in the American military. And he prepares to defend New Orleans. He had no real military experience or training except fighting the Indians. This was going to be different. The British had somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 regulars ready to attack New Orleans. Imagine how many ships they had that had to bring these 7,000 or 8,000 men there. It defies description. They were led by a guy named General Edward Pakenham, who was a brilliant, brilliant British general, had fought with Wellington. In fact, he was Duke Wellington, who had just defeated Napoleon. He was Wellington's, well, he had not, that would be a little bit later, I'm sorry. Napoleon was defeated twice, don't worry. But anyway, Wellington, that was his brother-in-law. Pakenham was married to Wellington's sister. So he was a very prominent guy, had just played a very important role in the first defeat of Napoleon. Napoleon was defeated, exiled to Elba, snuck back, fought again, and was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Okay, so they were the 2 comings of Napoleon. But anyway, Pakenham was a well-known general, 8,000 or so British regulars. Jackson had a hodgepodge of troops. He had some regulars. The thing that Pakenham underestimated, he had 20 cannons, artillery pieces. Pakenham did not believe our whole army had 20 pieces. And he had 9 or 10 really, heavy guns. And then when Pakenham heard that Jackson might have some guns, yeah, but these stupid militiamen, they're not well trained. They won't know how to fire the guns. But Jackson had recruited pirates, including the great John Lafitte, and others who knew how to fire guns. I mean, they made a living doing it. So Pakenham said militiamen are cowards. They're not trained well. As soon as they see the regulars with their bayonets, they're going to run like heck, like we did during the Revolution, like we did during the War of 1812. Don't worry about it. But Jackson had some regulars, some that had graduated West Point. This was the first real big battle that some West Pointers played a role in, to be honest. Also, Jackson's militiamen were hardened Indian fighters. Almost every one of Jackson's militiamen had been in battle of some kind. And one guy did a study once and thought that at least 30% of them had killed an Indian in battle. So these weren't guys who were going to be nervous. They were veterans, so to speak. They were in combat. They had been shot at and shot people and had no qualms about killing people. Neither did John Lafitte and his pirates. Jackson, of course, as always, was smart enough to recruit some Indians and even free blacks. Jackson, who owned slaves, eventually over 100. Jackson recruited free blacks, and there were many around New Orleans at that time, and he recruited them. Jackson had maybe 5,000 or 6,000 men, but he was going to be lucky. He knew the British were going to come after him. So he prepared defensive positions. Not a lot of cotton bales. Don't believe he was on top of cotton bales. They're inflammable. He had some cotton bale, but they were toward the back. He made earthen defense networks. You weren't going to put cotton bale. You weren't going to depend on that. But anyway, Jackson did set up some decent defenses, and the Battle of New Orleans climaxed on January the 8th, 1815. Most people think it was a one-day battle. It was actually not. It lasted about 2 weeks. The British did probe a little bit, but Pakenham wanted to go and attack Mobile Bay, which he later did. He wanted to go back to the West Indies to secure British colonies because England was at war with other countries at this time, including France. So he didn't want to waste a lot of time in New Orleans, and he finally made the decision on January the 8th, look, we're going to have a frontal assault. I'm banking on the fact these militiamen are going to panic. I'm banking on the fact that, yeah, Jackson has cannons, artillery, but they're not going to be very accurate, and the guys shooting them are probably going to shoot backwards, so don't worry about it. And he didn't do enough probing. He did send one small group of men around the rear of Jackson. Jackson was totally unprepared for that, got caught with his pants down, so to speak. But he was lucky that didn't hurt him. Jackson was not flawless by any means at New Orleans. They say it's better to be lucky than talented. In New Orleans, Jackson was lucky. Pakenham's mistakes. In a battle, it's often not that one side loses, the other wins. I didn't necessarily win. Maybe the other guy lost. And at New Orleans, Jackson really didn't win. Pakenham lost by making some very foolish gambles or some very preventable mistakes. But anyway, on January the 8th, Pakenham orders a frontal assault. The British ran into a lot of bad luck. The weather was a little tough. There was a heavy fog cover, which didn't help their coordination. Everything went well for Jackson. He told his men to just wait until they're almost on top of us, and then they opened up. The Battle of New Orleans itself on January the 8th, the culmination is 2-week siege. That battle lasted no more than 50 minutes. At the end, 2,000 Englishmen were killed or wounded or missing. 2,000. The battlefield was a pure red of the British uniforms laying there. Jackson lost maybe 70 seriously wounded, 300 wounded, killed total. He killed or wounded or captured over 2,000 English soldiers. It was a magnificent, magnificent victory. And in a war that didn't go particularly well for us, that was the last battle of the war. It made it seem to the Americans like we won the war. Now, here's the irony of New Orleans. The peace treaty ending the war, called the Treaty of Ghent, it was signed in Ghent, Belgium, that had been signed on Christmas Eve of 1814. So the war was already over, in a way. The treaty had been signed, and ironically, 2 of our negotiators, we had about 5, over at Ghent negotiating the treaty, 2 became Jackson's mortal enemies, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. When Jackson won the presidency twice, he would defeat John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. So, and little did he know that they were helping to make him a hero here. Now, here's why Jackson becomes greater. I mean, if you killed Indians, you're a great general. If you kill the British, you're God. If you kill the Indians and the British in the United States, then you're somewhere beyond God. Somewhere even Michael Jordan or somebody. Okay. Or should we say LeBron? I don't know. After that Minnesota Vikings thing, that quarterback there. Okay. But anyway, Jackson... Who you clapping for, me or the Vikings? I'm an Eagle fan, but I'm rooting for the Vikings because I could say, and I know you're not old enough, I was in the stands the last time the Eagles won a championship. In 1960, I was in the stand. And I was in the stands a couple years later when they snowballed Santa Claus, their fans. And don't you believe they did? They did. They threw beer bottles at him and everything. And I don't blame them. Santa Claus was drunk as a skunk and staggering along. You could tell it from the 3 decks up. All right. Anyway, I did that joke for a reason. Here, I want you to follow this. The news of the victory at New Orleans took about 2 weeks for the news to get back to Washington, right? Even though the treaty at Ghent had been signed on Christmas Eve, it took 6 weeks for that to get back to Washington, the news. So the news of the victory of New Orleans got to the capital, which the British had just burned, incidentally. The news of New Orleans got to Washington 10 days before the news of the treaty. So what did the American people assume? Here comes the news of the victory at New Orleans, which Andrew Jackson pulled off. And then a little later, the British signed a treaty. So what did that mean? We won the war because the last battle was New Orleans and Jackson won it, right? And therefore, Jackson's a great hero. And here was the logic. Pakenham and Wellington and all these guys, the great British Army and Navy had defeated Napoleon, the greatest general of all time. And Jackson defeated the what? British. So who's the greatest general of all time? Andrew Jackson. And people believed it. I mean, talk about fake news, huh? And Bill O'Reilly said it was true, so damn it. And not only that, but Rachel Maddow, so that made it true. All right, so Jackson is he was the biggest hero in the country until Washington, since Washington, and maybe the biggest hero until Pershing in World War I. We had a lot of heroes in the Revolution or the Civil War, but remember, one side didn't like the heroes on the other, right? So you could argue there was never a general who had more renown than Jackson, really, with the unadulterated love of the American people until at least World War I, maybe Patton and Eisenhower in World War II. Okay, I would have said MacArthur, except he was always a little controversial. Okay, loved and hated, but certainly Jackson was loved by the American people. And already people are talking about running him for president. And Jackson begins to believe his press clippings, that maybe I will someday run for president. So the Battle of New Orleans actually occurs after the war's over, but nobody on the battlefield knew it. And to be honest, the treaty was not yet ratified by either Parliament or the United States Senate. So really, the treaty was not quite finalized when the Battle of New Orleans took place. Nobody, not Pakenham, not Jackson, not anybody at New Orleans knew that the war was over, in a way. The treaty was not modified. We accepted it. The British accepted it. There is a theory, which I don't think is true, it's debatable, that the British, had we not beaten them at New Orleans so decisively, that they might have asked for some amendments to the treaty at the last second before it was ratified. There's never been any direct proof of that, possibly, but certainly the fact that we won at New Orleans eliminated any possibility of that. And I want to tell you one trivia that I cannot resist. I'm weak. Pakenham's wife, who obviously was Wellington's sister. And Wellington became Arthur Wellesley. That was his real name. In case you're wondering, Wellesley and Wellington, same thing. She made him swear that if he ever got killed, that his men would bring his body somehow or another back to England, whether he was killed in Europe or wherever. She always felt if he was killed, it'd be in Germany or somewhere. But here he's killed 4,000 miles away. But his men are committed to bringing him back. Now, how are you going to bring the body back that far? It's going to take 5-6 weeks. And in fact, took longer. So what they did is they put him in a keg of rum. True story. They put him in a keg of rum, and that preserved the body back to England. And that's where the phrase dead drunk arose. And I know a little about that. Okay. So, Jackson, from then on, from 1815 on, they're talking about making him president. He did have some political experience. Again, he had briefly, before all this, been a congressman, a senator, a judge. He was not unqualified. Certainly not. And he was a very popular guy. In fact, until the 20th century, we had no national holidays except July 4th and January 8th. Imagine a national holiday commemorating the Battle of New Orleans. So every January 8th, people were reminded who was God Andrew Jackson, not too bad. Okay, but anyhow, was he the hero or the common man? Now the myth is going to be that Jackson becomes president because all the common people loved him. Jackson did not create what we call the new democracy. Around this time, especially after the War of 1812 and before the Civil War, in that 40-year period or so, almost every state gave all free white men the right to vote. The federal government never passed an act, the federal government never passed an act to improve voting rights until we passed the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote in 1870. So any promotion of democracy came on a state-by-state basis. And the truth is that by the time Jackson was elected president in 1828, most states had already given all white men the right to vote. In fact, some states allowed blacks to vote if they were free in the North. Not all, but some. Okay? So Jackson never really promoted democracy. He did not, the way I had a professor that said it this way, Jackson did not create the new democracy. He was a creature of the new democracy. Did most of the common folk eventually vote for Jackson? Yeah, 60%. But did 100%? No. Jackson, both times he was elected president, got 55% of the vote. Good. You're not going to recount, right? But I mean, hell, Nixon got 60% once. Reagan got near 60%. Warren Harding got 62% of the vote. So was Jackson overwhelmingly supported by the common people? No. Did a majority of them vote for him? Yeah. But did some of them vote against him? Mm-hmm. So don't ever buy this thing that he was solely put into office on the backs of the common man. He wasn't. He was more of a creature of the new democracy. He never really championed the cause of the common man as much as he asked the common man to champion the cause of Andrew Jackson. But that was true of every politician. Jackson, all right, one of my professors argued vehemently that he never did anything to really help the people. No great welfare law, no Social Security, no national health insurance. But back then, nobody thought of this stuff. Jackson was a liberal for his time. He was what we call a classical liberal, who now would be a conservative. Jackson believed, yes, that all white men should vote. He said all white men are equally better than all other white men, whatever that meant. You're equally better. Did he ever say women should vote? Quite the opposite. Did he ever say that blacks should vote? Free black? He owned 200 of them. Wasn't going to let them vote. They'd outvote him 200 to 1. All right? That wasn't going to happen. But Jackson did believe that all white men, that's called Herrenvolk democracy, where you believe in democracy, but only democracy for a small group of people. In this case, about half the people in the country, the white men. All right, so yeah, he did believe, but he was a classical liberal. What does that mean? He didn't, nobody at this time, a couple of flacos over in Europe, but nobody in the United States believed in welfare or Social Security or national health insurance or unemployment compensation. Nobody. But Jackson believed in this, that the duty of the government was to create a level playing field for all white men. Modern liberals want to help the poor and the common people from the bottom up by the government giving them things, in a sense, health insurance, Social Security, unemployment, right? Jackson, the liberals at this time, the classical liberals, believed in the opposite. What the government should do is make sure nobody had unfair advantage. So what Jackson wanted to do was control big business, control the people, the elites. Like Trump, he railed against the elites. He felt that, for example, he's going to hate the Bank of the United States because that was controlled by an elite group of stockholders. So what Jackson felt, level the playing field. Give business, give politicians, give nobody unfair advantage. Level the playing field and let it go from there. He believed in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. He felt if he worked his way up from being an orphan, a war veteran, all that, and became president of the United States, then anybody could do it. All right, so what you should do is merely the government's function is to create equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Yes, all white men should be able to vote. There should be equality under the law. Nobody should be given any advantages just because of birth or they're rich or whatever. But they shouldn't be punished either. If your dad left you $1 million, so be it. All right, but no one should gain anything over anybody else account of that. And that was a liberal for the time. The classical liberals today would be the laissez-faire type, Paul Ryan, Ted Cruz. I think Ronald Reagan in modern times was a prime example of a classical liberal. Certainly the common people voted for Reagan. That's obviously got almost 60% of the vote was. But he never ran around saying, let's give him this, that. More or less create equality of opportunity. Okay. So, and now the modern liberalism, which didn't really take hold in this country, really until at least the 1920s or before, a little before, was where the modern liberals want to have more of a welfare state. Okay, so Jackson was a classical liberal for his time. All right, there's Rachel. In 1820, Jackson thought about running for president, but James Monroe was president. He had been elected in 1816. Jackson kind of respected Monroe, so he made no effort. And in 1820, we're in what was called the era of good feelings, meaning we only had one political party. By 1820, our first two-party system had kind of disappeared, and there was one major party called the Democratic Republicans. Confusing because now we have the Democrats and the Republicans, but I try to tell that to an 18-year-old. But in 1820, Monroe became and remains the only man ever to run for president without any opposition except George Washington. Monroe won every state. You might have thought that was 2016 when Trump won every. All right. Okay. What's that, you say? Now, you know how nerdish I am? You can see I'm not going to know. There was one elector. Monroe had no opposition. He won every electoral vote. But one elector, a guy named Plummer, honest to God, a guy named Plummer from New Hampshire up there, he wouldn't vote for Monroe because he didn't personally like him, thought Monroe was corrupt. And he didn't vote for Monroe. He voted for somebody else, John Quincy Adams. So Monroe won every electoral vote save one. That elector was supposed to vote for Monroe, but he broke his pledge and did not. Isn't that something? How would you like to win that way? Woo! The only time we came kind of close is in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt carried 46 of the 48 states. In 1972, Nixon carried 49 of the 50. Remember? What one didn't he? Massachusetts, come on, where are you Republicans? And then in 1984, Reagan carried 49 out of 50, all except Minnesota. Now root for the Vikings, you Republicans. Okay. That's Walter Mondale, remember, was from Minnesota. Okay, so, but by 1824, Monroe, having served 2 terms, honored the tradition of the unofficial tradition of not running for a 3rd term. And 4 candidates emerged for president, actually 5. They all claim to be Democratic Republicans or no party. In fact, I just read a book which was entitled The Presidential Election in Which There Were No Parties. In which there were no parties. This was 1824. All right. 4 names emerged. Andrew Jackson, who was the hero of everybody. John Quincy Adams, probably the most qualified person ever to run for president, period. He had been Secretary of State, an ambassador, a congressman. He was everything. His dad had been president, John Adams. So we now have the Bushes and the Adamses. All right, remember that comical monster show, The Addams Family? They spelled it with 2 Ds. The reason is because there was a show at the same time on public television, called the Addams Chronicles, about the Addams family throughout American history. So they wanted to differentiate, and they had the 2 Addams. Remember the Addams family and the Munsters and all that was kind of a big thing back then. Well, John Quincy Adams was a Secretary of State. William Crawford, who you probably never heard of, William Harris Crawford, he was a very prominent Southerner. an old line Jeffersonian in the South, really liked William Crawford, big slave owner, believed in strict construction of the Constitution, very conservative guy, and the dynamic archenemy of Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, the magnificent Clay, who I think was the greatest American politician who never became president. He ran 3 times, lost 3 times. It's going to be the first time. Clay later said, "I'd rather be right than president." Somebody yelled out, "You'll never be either, Henry." But anyway, Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House, very powerful, that's important. And how were these guys nominated, by the way? This was the last time that a nomination was put in by, I'll stop soon. Up until this point, and including 1824, the way most presidential candidates were nominated, especially by the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans as Jefferson called them, that was his party, somewhere about a year before the election, all the congressmen and senators of that party would get together in Washington and they'd have a meeting called a caucus, right? And they'd suggest somebody for president and vice president. And that's how most presidential candidates were nominated. It was a very small group, sometimes 40, 50 people. And they would nominate somebody for president. That caucus, in this age of democracy, and Jackson, again, championing the cause of the common people, Jackson didn't believe in the caucus. He felt it was too elitist, and he hated elites because he was never part of one as a young man. He certainly was now. By the time he ran for president in 1824, Jackson was one of the richest men in Tennessee, had a plantation called the Hermitage that was bigger than Mount Vernon, for God's sake, all right, and was a very wealthy horse breeder and the whole bit. All right, but anyway, the caucus, and the last time it ever met, nominated Crawford. But these other guys were nominated by state legislatures. For example, the state legislature of Tennessee, more than a year before the election, passed a resolution saying we support Andrew Jackson. The legislature of Pennsylvania nominated John C. Calhoun. There was actually a 5th candidate for a while, John C. Calhoun, who would also become very, very important to Jackson in American history. Anyway, these were the 4 guys. Calhoun was a candidate at first, but when he realized he had no traction, he was a little young, Calhoun backed out and agreed to become vice president. So Calhoun is going to wind up after this election being vice president under Adams. Then he's going to wind up being vice president under Jackson. So he served as vice president under 2 different presidents. Only 2 men have ever done that. But anyway, the most famous being John C. Calhoun. All right, so it narrowed down to these guys. And here are the results. And it would be the same if it happened today. I'm sorry this is not pointing right. Come on, Rachel. Okay, Jackson got about 42% of the popular vote, 99, you could see what happened, right? These popular votes are guesstimates because in some states, there were 24 states, in 6 of them, only 6, the electors were appointed by the state legislatures. In other words, the people didn't vote, even for electors. You know what you voted in November? You voted for electors pledge to Trump, electors pledge to Clinton, whatever. All right? All right, in these days, same thing, except in 6 states, you didn't even get to do that. The state legislature appointed the electors. If you're a Republican, you want to be really afraid in California? Technically, a state could still do that. California could pass a law today with the heavy Democratic dominance in Sacramento and say, we're just going to put 55 votes in for Kamala Harris or somebody in 2020, right? Okay, you got it. All right, so in these days, by 1832, there'd only be 1 state doing it, South Carolina, and South Carolina would continue to appoint electors until 1860. But after 1832, it was only South Carolina. Now, of course, nobody does it that way, but theoretically, they could. All right, so here's how it came out. If fair was fair, Jackson would have won, right? What's the rule if it happens today? No, you have to receive a majority of the electoral votes. That means over half of the electoral votes. Jackson didn't have that. He had a plurality, but not a what? Majority. He had a plurality of the popular votes, but not a what? Majority. And you know how it works. Hillary won the popular vote last time out. Trump won the electoral vote. Trump's president. Same thing here. It's the electoral votes that count. But what happens, and it would happen again today if it happened, The top 3 electoral vote, and I used to be able to eliminate some of these. I was going to work my way up, but the damn thing's not working. The rule is the House of Representatives picks the president from the top 3 electoral vote getters. That eliminated Clay. Even though he ran 3rd in the popular vote, he was a little ahead of Crawford, he ran 4th in the electoral. Henry Clay was Speaker of the House. So if Henry Clay would have made the top 3, he probably would have been what? He would have been picked. But as his luck would have it, every time he ran for president, something happened, and he gets eliminated. So the names that go to the House of Representatives are Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Give me 5 more minutes, then I'm going to play a song, and I'm going to let you go, and I'll review this on Thursday. It's very complicated. If no one receives a majority electoral votes, the House of Representatives then picks the president, but from the top 3. Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Doesn't matter whether you ran 1st or 3rd, the House has a choice, right? But not every congressman gets a vote. There are 435 congressmen today. Not everyone gets a vote. Every state gets a vote. So in other words, if you're from Delaware, where I live now, there's 1 congressman. He gets the damn vote. In our case, a she now. She would get the vote. California, the big deals, they're 53. Some Republicans, some Democrats. They'd have to be herded into a room, could you imagine that, and come out with what? 1 vote. Could you imagine that? And the rule is the House votes and votes until 1 of the 3 gets a majority of the states. Today that would be 26, right? Majority of 50, majority means half plus 1. So there are 50 states. No, plurality means you have more votes than anybody else. But majority means you have over half. I'll give you a little test. If you have majority, do you have to have plurality? Yeah, you do. If you have over half the votes, you've got to have plurality because you have more than everybody else put together. If you have 51% of the votes, the other guys can't add up to you, can they? You understand what I'm saying? All right, so every state gets 1 vote. In these days, there were 24 states, so you had to get 13. All right, I'll review this. I see a couple of people leaving. Henry Clay was the king. Henry Clay was the kingmaker. It was understood that whoever he backed would become president. He backed Adams. And on the first ballot, 13 states voted for Adams, 7 for Jackson, 4 for Crawford. So Adams was picked president even though he ran 2nd in both the popular and the electoral votes. The Jacksonian people, and Jackson included, start screaming that this was a corrupt deal. This forever became known as the corrupt bargain election. For the rest of their lives, Clay and Adams had to wear not the adulterer sign, but the C sign for the corrupt bargain on their foreheads. This haunted them for the rest of their careers. Jackson and the Democrats, his party eventually was called the Democrats, they called this the corrupt bargain. And Jackson said that from the moment that Clay was picked, that he had been sold out by Clay to Judas of the West. He said, from now on, I'm going to do 2 things by 1828. I'm going to get elected president in 1828, but I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to work my tail off until 1828, one with blinders on. I'm going to be president, and I'm going to form a new party. And by 1828, Jackson formed the party, and he ran as a Democrat in 1828. And the Democrats of today, the first candidate they ever ran was Andrew Jackson in 1828. And before I play you that song, the Democrats since 1828, through good and bad times, have never missed an election. In 1832, they held their first ever convention, quadrennial convulsion if you're a Democrat, and they nominated Jackson for a 2nd term. The Democrats have never missed a convention since 1832. And the Democratic Party was formed out of this mess between 1824 and 1828. Eventually, the party of Clay and Adams became known as the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. I'll get into that next week. Not W-I-G-S, that's on Trump's head. W-H-I-G-S. A Whig, it's a name in England. In England, the party that opposes the king is called a Whig party, historically. They opposed royal authority, and the Whigs claimed Jackson was trying to be king. So they called themselves the Anti-Jackson or the Whig Party. We're against King Andrew I. And if you know, where did that stupid name WHIG come from? It was an old Irish political faction called the Whigamores. So now you know where the Whigs in England came from, the Whigs in the United States came from. But in 1824, they were all Democratic Republicans. By 1828, Jackson was calling himself a Democrat, and we've had the Democratic Party for good and ill ever since. Okay, now, I have, in about 1959, a record came out that went almost, I guess, #1. It was the highest best-selling country and Western record of all time on the regular charts at that point by Johnny Horton. Unfortunately, he died in a plane crash or a car crash not long after that, after this record came out. And then Patsy Cline died not long after that in a plane crash. I played this Battle of New Orleans by Johnny Horton so many times when I was in high school. Everybody else was playing Elvis. I know what you're thinking. In my high school days, it was Bing Crosby. It was Rudy Valet. That's who the hell it was. But anyway, I wore the damn record out, that one of those 45s, you know, with the hole in the middle and all that crap. All right, but anyway, Johnny Horton, the battle, I'll leave, then you can leave after this, but please stay for this one. Go ahead, Dustin. The Battle of New Orleans by my hero, Johnny Horton.
We took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We looked down a river and we see the British come, and there must have been 100 of them beating on the drum. They stepped so high and they made the bugles ring. We stood beside our cotton bales and didn't say a thing. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
That is his bandstand.
Old Hickory said we could take them by surprise if we didn't fire muskets till we looked them in the eye. We held our fire till we see their faces well, then we opened up our squirrel guns and really gave them well. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We fired our cannon till the barrel melted down, so we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled his head with cannonballs and powdered his behind, and when we touched the powder off, the gator lost his mind. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Up, up, rip, four, sound, go, rip, four, up, rip, four.
Okay, see you Thursday. Thanks a lot.